Oh, there we go. Here it goes. So, Vicky Old
Was
Knee.
that the? I didn't manage. I didn't manage to watch to do more than the reading this week. So is that the optional video
Yeah,
from the Chat Emory School of Law?
that's right. Yeah, Stanley Hauerwas. He's actually
Okay.
a scholar of some.
Oh, that's the chap that was mentioned quite frequently in the Brown book. Oh,
Yeah, he does come up. He's very well regarded, very well respected. So Stanley Hauer says all that stuff. People at better still notice. It's not like me
okay.
saying it. So, shall I share the slideshow and then we'll look at it together? Where is it? I know it's here somewhere. There it is. Right. Can you all see that?
Yep, yep.
Yes.
So, what human rights are? Precursors of human rights declarations, where human rights come from, tensions and controversies, moral disengagement, conflict of interest. So, what are human rights? What do you reckon?
Well, I guess personally, I would think that human rights are about sort of what we would sort of expect would be um, the, the most sort of normative expectations of human existence. That you should be able to, um, well, actually, what would that really relate to? I mean, one can only really frame it in one's experience, isn't it? So all of the things that I might think about, like being able to kind of be able to have access to food, access to water, access to warmth and shelter. That's because that's absolutely, I guess, what we've become accustomed to in our society as a norm. One would hope that one could be able to go about one's daily life without being molested in any way, shape, or form. But I suspect that, within other cultures, none of that is taken as a given. Um,
If you think back to, say, medieval culture, you'd have droit de seigneur. Where is the phrase?
no,
Well, droit is the French word for right. Droit de seigneur is the right of the lord or right of the master. And it was, I'm not sure if it ever was actually practiced, but the idea that somehow the baron, the landowner, had the first dibs at sleeping with the girl before she got married. That was something like his lawful right. So that is one usage of the word right. Someone has the legal, like, one can do something with legal propriety. One doesn't have to do it, but if one wishes to, then it cannot be rightfully uh, resisted or rejected. So would that be a human right?
I'm so sorry, Jeremy. I we've upgraded our computer, and I haven't learned how to. I was just trying to turn the volume up because I couldn't really hear you, and I was so busy trying to work out how to do that that I didn't actually quite catch what you said. Sorry about that.
Okay. In medieval Europe, possibly, I'm not sure how true this is or if it's ever really done, but there's the idea of droit de seigneur,
Yeah.
right of the master or right of the lord. And obviously I'm quoting that because it uses the word right. In other words, it uses right in the legal sense, that the master has a right to do something, or the lord has a right to do something. And normally the droit de seigneur is the right of a landowner to lie with a woman before she gets married. So how does that as a right compare with human rights?
Well, I wouldn't personally see that one's terribly valid.
Oh. The reason I'm asking it is not to ask for your moral approval of it. I'm asking, what do these words right mean? What does it mean to invoke a right? That's what I wish to examine. That's partly what Stanley Howes was talking about as well, actually.
So I guess there's probably a number of different foundations for people's belief in a right. She says, having just completely lost her train of thought.
I remember, have you ever read the novel Dune?
No.
Yeah.
Well, I quite liked it. I read it several times when I was young. And in that, the Fremen have what they call leader's right. That the leader of a raid has first dibs on the plunder. And I can't remember exactly how it works out, but that idea of leader's right was it was a kind of concrete thing for them, for the Fremen, and for their kind of martial kind of society.
Well, I suppose if we're looking at what we imagine the word is signifying, then what we think is that it's a correction, it's a kind of an appropriateness or something that's basic and fundamental to one's essential humanity. One would imagine potentially something that is so, but I guess again that can be quite culturally interpreted, because I might say, well, I think it's one of my basic human rights to be afforded personal dignity.
So one of the things I think that's concerning about rights is the way that language is used. So when you talk about dignity, what precisely would you mean by that?
Exactly. Yeah. And this is what just drives me insane really about politics and ethics. It's just so convoluted.
Yeah. I always think that the most meaningful word, the way the droit de seigneur, I quote it partly because it's revolting.
Yes.
But it uses the idea of a legal right. But actually, it's very, very clearly defined, because droit de seigneur is very explicit. It's absolutely clearly what is implied. The master has the right to lie with the woman before her wedding. He doesn't have to exercise it, of course, but he has the right. Therefore, if a family or a woman resists it, they're actually breaking the law. They're actually doing something which is illegal. Therefore, in theory, unethical. They're denying the Lord his right. But it's also very clearly enforceable. Not only is it clearly defined, exactly what's involved in this, but if he simply has the strength to do it, then he can do it. But if he lacks the strength to do it and he can't do it, that droit de seigneur means nothing. And I think that's one of the main queries about the way that rights are invoked, in that how can you actually execute them? How do you deliver them? Because one of the primary schools near is very keen on the rights of the child, and they have them pinned up all over the school. The right to education, the right to leisure, the right to play, the right to healthcare, the right to a safe home. Well, how on earth do you guarantee that? How do you actually execute that? So if you're talking about the rights for a child, what are you actually saying, apart from giving a lot of sort of virtue signaling hot air? I mean, how are you actually going to deliver that to every child on earth? And what's the plan? As far as I can tell, there isn't one. You can't even deliver it to every child in Britain, let alone the whole world. So, what are you actually saying when you say that kind of thing? You're saying, I mean, you talked about norms. You're saying, well, this is what we'd like to happen, or this is what should happen, or this, in an ideal world, is how things would be. In which case, is there a better language to use? Is there a better kind of way of saying these things?
Well, I suspect there's probably plenty of groups of people discussing that all over the place
well,
right
I'm
now.
not sure there are actually. That's the thing, because the whole right thing, the whole human right thing, is becoming law and it's invoked in all kinds of ways. But very, very few people actually think about it. They act as if it's true without actually asking themselves, well, what actually is true about this? They act as if they know it's true for themselves, but what about for other people? And one of the, to my mind, the big problems with rights is that once you start invoking rights, it then simply becomes a matter of competition about which rights are invoked over which other ones. So it becomes basically a kind of enforceable test of strength about basically who can enforce their rights over the other. In which case, you're not adjudicating based upon merit or based on goodness or truth or integrity or any other kind of moral quality. You're actually simply becoming a power struggle. In which case, it's droit de seigneur all over again. If I can, I will. Might is right. Which surely is what the whole ethical debate is supposed to avoid. We're not supposed to be discussing things simply it is right to do it because we can. The whole thing is, well, what is proper to do? And that was Hauer's point when talking about rights, is that if you actually talk about rights without talking about compassion and goodness and truth, he said there's something wrong. These are only, the concept of rights is only meaningful when you already have a moral foundation apart from rights. So rights are a way of describing something which is already given or already explained or already qualified. But it can't be a means of qualifying or explaining or defining something that's not yet defined. I think I completely agree with him then. I think he's absolutely right. Anyway. But the whole thing about rights is, though, they are integrated into national and international legal systems. They are very much a legal thing. I think that's the important thing which they can be, is they can be legal. It's hard to build what you might call a moral or an ethic into law. So law has to be proved, beyond reasonable doubt in the court, all that kind of thing. But a right can be defined in that way. So I think that's the most constructive way they can be used, basically as legal mechanisms, legal tools. So, but they can't, to my mind, they can't be an end in themselves. Precursors of human rights declarations. Well, I think this is a little bit generous, personally. And the Code of Hammurabi, he wouldn't have dreamed of human rights. If you actually read it, he's not talking about human rights. He's talking about laws. These are the kind of lawgivers of history. The Hammurabi and Cyrus and Ashoka. These are the people. And when they talk about rights, they talk about, say, the right to a well, meaning that you live in a certain area, therefore it is proper for you to be able to access a certain amount of water because you live there. So in other words, that kind of right is very clearly circumscribed and qualified. And then you get the whole idea of what they call natural rights. Well, that's precisely where droit de seigneur comes from. It's the idea of a natural right. It's the natural right of a lord to execute his will. And it's the natural virtue of the peasantry to acquiesce to their lord's will. Not that we'd really go with that now. So I've noticed they haven't mentioned Tom Paine here. Have you heard of Tom Paine?
Yes, back of my mind, he's there somewhere.
Yeah, he actually wrote a book called The Rights of Man.
And yes, it does.
That's one of the kind of pivotal texts in it. And we haven't got Rousseau here. So, but I think Rousseau is very important in the way that people think about rights now, because Rousseau's basic assumption is that people are naturally good and virtuous. And a lot of rights legislation is based on that premise, where, of course, the Bible says that we're not naturally good and virtuous, but naturally wicked. So there's an immediate sort of contention there between a Christian way of looking at things and that kind of way. John Locke was a Christian and therefore wouldn't argue in the same way. So, where do human rights come from? Notice I haven't mentioned Tom Paine. Still haven't mentioned Tom Paine. Or Rousseau yet. Religious or ethical concerns. And then we get the divine image. How did the divine image impinge on the abolition of the slave trade?
Was there a belief that the slaves were less than human?
That's what justified their enslavement, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they weren't fully human. They
Yeah.
were somehow a lesser form of human. Or somehow that normal human values wouldn't somehow apply to them. And yeah, so how would you argue against that?
Violently.
No, upon what premise though? How would you rationalize? How would you refute that assertion?
Oh, we're all made in God's image.
Absolutely. Yeah. And from a Christian theological point of view, that's just how it is. There's nothing much you can say about that.
Yeah.
And which is, of course, why slavery was abolished in the early Middle Ages in Britain, why it was never reinstated, because men are made in the image of God. And why basically most nations, when they became Christian, then abolished slavery. So the pagan Vikings, for example, were great traders in slaves and great utilizers of slaves. Once they Christianized, suddenly the whole question of slavery became a different question. And interestingly, in the late empire, in late antiquity, I can't remember when slavery was actually abolished, if it ever was, to be honest. But you see the whole drift of thinking of popular culture in the late empire begins to withdraw from slavery. You know, the whole notion of it becomes difficult, and you get people like, there's a woman called Melania, an heiress, inherited a vast fortune, had a very fervent faith, and she is supposed to have liberated 10 or 20,000 slaves or something using her fortune because she could pay for their manumission. And so that kind of example of Christianity then becomes they become exemplars of the new way of living. So if you like, slavery becomes disreputable, or it becomes somehow instead of being normative or somehow proper, it then becomes sordid or somehow questionable, even if it's still legal. And I can't remember the progress of it, so I mean, you'd have to kind of go into the detail of that. But it's an interesting kind of trend. But it's it took a long time for the Romans to actually formally, abolish it. I don't know Mary Wollstonecraft though, so I don't really know what she said there. What about the four freedoms? What does that say? Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear.
It's a bit loose.
Yep. And what else? What's he saying? What do you think he's actually trying to get at?
I think he wants people to be free in that not being oppressed in certain ways, but like not being hungry or frightened to worship and speech. But freedom is not the same as license.
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where does it become a problem? So freedom of speech, for example, actually is enshrined in the US Constitution. So is he saying the same thing as I have a right to say whatever I want?
No. I mean, the old classic is you can't shout fire in a theatre.
Versus Larry Flint.
I'm sorry you didn't get that then.
Did you ever see the film called The People versus Larry Flint?
No.
It's quite a good film, actually. Ed Norton plays a lawyer who's working for a man called Larry Flint. And Larry Flint, who's played by Woody Harrelson, is the publisher of Hustler.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And people want to close him down. They want to ban the magazine. And so Ed Norton, as his lawyer, argues in defense of his freedom to publish that it's a freedom of speech issue. And basically, he ends up being vindicated. So does he have a right to publish it? Is this a civil right, a human right? Or is he free to publish?
I think he's free. He's not right. He's got a right to publish it.
If he has a right to publish, that means his publishing cannot be contradicted. If he is free to publish, then of course other things could be contradicted.
Yeah. But I mean, he might have a right to publish it, but if he didn't have the money, he couldn't do it. So, somebody will say, "Oh, because you haven't got the money, you're stopping my right to free speech." Well, it doesn't quite work like that, does it?
Well, he had the money.
Well, yeah, but say, no, I don't think he's free to do it. I don't think it's. I'm not enamored by this term rights anyway. No, I think. Well, I always believe that a right is not something you give somebody; it's something you can't take away from somebody.
Yeah, that's one of the implications of it, isn't it? It's something that cannot be taken away.
And to be honest with you, we don't really have that many rights, do we?
Well, that's one of the things, because I noticed the last Conservative government, in their ambitions to reduce immigration, made various efforts to do so. And usually the opposition to it was by human rights groups who are arguing that what the government was doing was somehow violating the rights of the people they're trying to get rid of. And a great many legal hurdles and barriers were put in their way, which is why the progress on it was so slow, and why, in the end, I think only one flight to Rwanda actually left. And then, having had one flight, Keir Starmer promptly abolishes the whole thing. The thing was, your point, it cannot be taken away, is precisely the point they are arguing. Now, although they were illegal immigrants, if you insist that they're rights, that means you're saying that their right to remain in the UK, despite having come here illegally, cannot be taken away. That means the government then cannot basically police the border. The government is not actually competent or willingly, does not have legal capacity to actually decide who is or is not a citizen, or who is permitted or not permitted to remain.
Well, that's why I think I don't think we have that many rights. There's rights are best arbitrary decisions made by people in power. If you don't have the power, you cannot uphold these rights.
No, which is precisely the point about, the rights being practical or enforceable, or,
Yeah.
doable, as it were. If you cannot guarantee them, then what does it actually mean to have a right? So, yeah, I agree with you on that front. Anyway, but I think that the Roosevelt's things, the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom of fear, I think in that many respects has a lot going for it, because then you're indicating a desire, but you're not indicating an absolute. You're saying that you wish for these things, but for example, freedom of speech, you're saying people should be free to speak. They should be free to express opinions and to state things, even if apparently unpopular or distasteful. Now that is, as I say, enshrined in the US Constitution. That doesn't necessarily, though, guarantee the right to say whatever you want whenever you want, which is precisely your point about saying fire in a theatre. So I think that is actually quite a constructive approach. You're indicating a direction, but you're not necessarily allowing everything. So freedom of worship, for example, in Hindu religion, there is the cult of Kali, which at times in the past has had what's called thuggee. And in the cult of thuggee, they used to occasionally carry out ritual murders as sacrifices to Kali. Now, is that included in freedom of worship? Ritual murder?
No.
So I would argue, for example, that, well, I would argue on the same basis. No, that cannot be so. That's not on.
Yeah.
So, freedom, if you like, to go about your business. But then common law and case law in the UK, broadly speaking, was that you had the right to be not interfered with unless you were doing something wrong, which I think is a very proper right. I think most people should have the right to not be interfered with unless they're doing something wrong, in which case they can be interfered with. They could be arrested, to put it in the jargon, which is proper. If someone is doing something wrong, then they should be arrested. They should be prevented. Anyway. And Howe has put it, when someone was murdered or some revolting thing was done, that they took away their rights. Well, he said, if that's the strongest possible language you could put it in, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's.
I completely agreed with him there. If that is honestly the most emotive way you could think of saying something. Where are you at? You've obviously had a very sheltered life. So the Nuremberg trials, because you get, what legality were they?
It was the legality of the victor.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's basically it, isn't it? So, I mean, it's not the kind of thing you'd want to do all the time, is it? And you wouldn't want too many of that kind of thing going on because, well, cui bono.
Yeah.
So legal rights recognized through formal legal process, legal positivism. So the American Declaration of Independence does have rights actually stated, the French Declaration of Rights of the Citizen. So what's the, if you like, the dubious pedigree of the French Declaration of Rights of the Citizen?
Well, they certainly killed a lot of people during the terror, didn't they?
They certainly did.
Woohoo!
There's definitely a few people who, for some reason, their rights didn't amount to very much.
No.
Yeah. So it's a bit like communism, isn't it? Everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others. So what went wrong, do you think?
Oh. Well, fear, lack of education, and general vindictiveness, I suppose.
I think general vindictiveness is a large component.
They also got rid of the church for a bit, which was basically the moral compass of most of the states in that time.
If you get rid of the church, and this is something that comes up elsewhere actually, upon what basis does one do morality?
Well, you could do the utilitarian happiness sums.
But, with all these theories, it always comes to the problem of why is it important? Why should we do it? Why not just be selfish, self-gratifying, corrupt? What's the point? And if we insist on having these moral qualities, how do we account for their origin? How do we know they're real? How can we somehow make these persuasive?
Well, Kant certainly, with his categorical imperatives, tries to use logic in saying that if everybody did something, if everybody stole, that means if everybody took everybody's private property, then the idea of private property would disappear. So you couldn't steal. So it would be illogical.
But, is it persuasive, though, if someone feels like stealing?
Oh, no, it's not persuasive.
Because somehow it's got to mean something to the people, hasn't it?
Well, I think he was going to think, well, we'll just get some policemen to hit him on top of the head. They do fall apart, Kant. I mean, intelligent bloke, and he's got some leeway there, but it does fall apart because the first thing you've got to assume is he assumes that the disappearance of private property is bad. So he's assumed that. So he's always basing something on an assumption.
Yeah.
He's trying to produce morality out of nothing, but he's always got to produce something. And like I say, the private property is good, the truth is good, the not being murdered is good.
Has its moments.
Yeah. So I think he flounders in the end because he hasn't got a rock to stand on to start off his journey.
Now, I was listening to a C.S. Lewis, or a lecture about C.S. Lewis actually earlier. I'm just trying to find it. Oh, here we go. What I'll do is I'll stop this share and I'll play that one.
Now, and it is still so relevant.
Can you hear it?
In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis makes an argument for Christianity primarily based on the moral argument. So he argues that we as humans apprehend moral law, right? We feel some sort of moral oughtness. We ought to do this. We ought not to do that. We have this sense of fairness. It's all innate. And he makes an argument from morality that God exists. This is so relevant today because our culture wants to have all of wants to retain so many ideas of morality. In fact, invent new morality as well. But they do it without any foundation. So they want to make all sorts of moral claims and have no foundation for those moral claims. C.S. Lewis challenges that in Mere Christianity, and it's influenced thousands and thousands of people. So Mere Christianity is a...
But I find it interesting that he's made the point that Lewis's apologetic for the existence of God and for believing in Jesus is based on the fact that everyone perceives a sense of morality. But without a concrete origin, it's free-floating, it's rootless. And I think he's got a good point there, you know, and I think Lewis also makes the point of that in The Abolition of Man. Have you read that?
No.
There he makes an argument about the objectivity of morals, but obviously it's rooted in his belief in God. So obviously, you know, in that book, it's actually a kind of prescient book, actually, because you can see how his critique of subjectivity and morals and ethics and subjectivity of knowledge and values has come down to the present day and undermined just about everything. And it's amazing. I think he wrote that in 1942 or something, 1941. So 80 years ago, he could see the way the tide was flowing. And now we can really see how it works out. So I'd thoroughly recommend The Abolition of Man, actually, as a book. And interesting, it's got a big preoccupation with ethics and morals. Not just that, but it's got a lot to do about that. Anyway, so if we go back to the slides, there we go. Right. Well, we've got loads of ground to cover, so let's move on. Legal rights. Do you want to watch the video?
I have watched it. I'm not sure if...
Rachel, would you like to see the video?
I think if Kevin's watched it, don't worry. It's my intention to try and catch up with these bits. So if there's loads to get on, I'll try and catch up with those.
Okay. I can't remember, to be honest, exactly what's in it. So here we go. Here we introduce Rousseau. Social claims often emerge from social movements and advocacy, NGOs, etc. Tensions and controversies. Political liberalism from Locke, where people should be able to do what they want, and political equality, which is Rousseau. Rousseau having the idea of the language of everyone born free that lives in chains. He's very keen on the idea of what you might call the noble savage. Some of civilization or society corrupt the goodness of the newborn child. Question though, if all newborn children are innately good, why is society corrupt?
Well, isn't this to do with our fall into a sinful state? And so although
Absolutely, yeah. Well, that's precisely the point. We are sinful, but Rousseau doesn't want to believe it. So yeah, I mean, Rachel, you're absolutely right. That is why society is corrupt, because we're not innocent when we're born. We grow up, and the evil in us makes society evil. There's actually nothing much we can do about that. But if someone was going to make the assertion that everyone is good when they're born or conceived or something, what would you say about that?
They've obviously never grown up with children.
Yeah, when my son was tiny, hated being left. And we tried for a long time to try and get him to settle into a creche so that Nikki and I could have a bit of time together, go to church. And he just wouldn't ever settle into a creche. We just couldn't leave him at anything. In the end, we just gave up. We just took him with us everywhere. And one of the ways I tried to get him integrated into the creche at the church we went to in Cardiff while I was at St Michael's was I'd lie on the floor and be as boring as I possibly could. And while I was there, he was content. I vanished and he'd kick off. While I was there, he was okay. But I didn't want to excite him. I wasn't there to entertain him. I wanted to be utterly dull so that he'd forget that I was there and get used to just being on his own. So I just used to lie there inert in the soft play area while all these kids were around. And I used to completely ignore all the children. So I was only there to shut up my son. And it was really interesting because it meant I just watched all these other children together, all these toddlers. And these are children that were basically crawling age up to 2.5, something like that. So 1.5 to 2.5. These weren't babes in arms, they were crawling and they were rolling around. And interestingly, children of that age do not play with each other. They'd go up to a toy and pick it up. And one other child would then come up and examine said toy, which the other one was holding, and then try and take it off them. And they would silently grapple over this trophy. And then when one of them finally gave up, the other one would hold it for a minute, look at it, and then throw it away. And that's all they did. It was a series of trials to see who would give up on the toy first. And my son was so embarrassing in that environment because he was actually extremely strong for his age. And he'd go up to these kids holding a toy and he would just mug them. He'd just rip it out of their arms and they would start howling and screaming and crying. And then he'd kind of wave it around and then throw it away. They had no interest in the thing in itself. The only interest was the rivalry. It was so curious to watch. And that's all they did. So yeah, it wasn't particularly edifying. It didn't give you a great deal of human nature there. It's the law of the jungle and that Tots group. Anyway. So state sovereignty versus international human rights obligations. And what is that then? How does that play out? Because the president part of the European Court of Human Rights. And does that invade the sovereignty? Does that compromise the sovereignty of our state? Does it compromise our legal system?
You've got to sign up to the Court of Human Rights.
Yeah.
Russia and Belarus hasn't.
Yeah.
So it's an opt-in club, really. Yep. Although there's some people want us to bail out, that would be good, I'm sure.
Would it be a problem if we did?
I think it would, because if there was a criminal in another country and we wanted him extradited to us, the first thing they would say to us is, "Oh, you're not part of the club." The answer is no.
Well, that's the extradition treaty. That's separate, I think.
But there would be a good reason not to.
Do you think a foreign legal authority is more competent to judge our affairs than our native one?
No, it's more of a... so there's judges from quite a number of countries, aren't there? But I think Britain set it up so it's more in favour of leaning towards us and the way we think than anything. It's not. It may be foreign, but it's not foreign to us legally. There's nothing I don't think we would object to.
In theory, I knew a lawyer who voted Brexit, and it was because of the European Court that he thought that Britain should leave the EU, because he said that the Napoleonic Code, the way the legal system in Europe works, is different from the British legal system, and that if you take, I saw an Australian lawyer speak about this as well. She was saying if you take a rights-based legal system versus a common law or case law system, such as in the UK or Australia, the two legal methodologies actually work in conflict with each other. So, as far as I understand it, our ancient common laws, case law, works on the principle that people should be free to go about their business unless they interfere with someone else and do something illegal, in which case they must be stopped. So it assumes you can do things without actually harming anyone else or interfering with anyone else. It means that you have, if you like, a right to be non-interfered with unless you're doing something wrong. But it means that you can't be compelled to do anything. There's no legal mechanism to make people do something. Whereas human rights laws often compel something. So, for example, Asher Baking Company thing, where they took the gay couple took the Asher Baking Company to court because they didn't want to make a cake that said support gay marriage. And the gay couple said it was their right to have the cake made by the Asher Company. And the Asher Baking Company said, no, we shouldn't be compelled to make this cake. And it was actually fought out at several layers of law. It eventually went to the High Court in the UK, and the Asher Baking Company were upheld. They didn't have to, they couldn't be compelled, if you like, to bake the cake if they didn't want to. But that's the kind of difference in it, in that the human rights law would compel someone to do something. Whereas, the traditional law in Britain would, if you like, not interfere with people. Those are the two kind of broad approaches to it. And so that's why the two systems, compete with each other or fight with each other. They actually get into direct conflict. So you see, one example of this is in safeguarding versus data protection. In safeguarding, you have to have a DBS, which means you're compelled to volunteer your criminal record. But data protection forbids the intrusion into privacy, which means that you can't compel a DBS on someone unless they strictly need it. Then you have to define precisely why they need it so that they don't have their privacy unjustly, if you like, violated. So you see, those two principles are actually working in opposition to each other. The safeguarding thing would want everyone to be DBS'd all the time, but data protection would want no one to be DBS'd ever as a invasion of privacy. So the question is, where do you do it then? When should people be compelled to spill the guts and disclose their criminal records, or when should their privacy be respected? So that's a kind of contention that's what I'm always dealing with in the church. Is who to DBS and who not. Does the treasurer need a DBS? Well, yes, because they're handling money. Does I don't know? Does a science person need a DBS? They're not handling money necessarily. They're not left alone with vulnerable adults. They're not looking after children. Personally, I think they shouldn't require DBSing unless they're going to take on some further responsibility. But there we go. And then you get universality versus cultural relativism. Now, this really, I think, is the big one. What do you reckon?
Cultural relativism is a
Cultural relativism is what?
It's like it's dangerous. It's a time bomb, really. I mean, just cause your culture does it doesn't mean it's right.
So how do you adjudicate then? Who says?
Oh, it's normally the one with the biggest army. Prove me wrong.
So take one example. Gangs of Pakistani men who are Muslims have been free to rape schoolgirls with impunity for many years now. Very few have been prosecuted in court. Is that cultural relativism? Is it just a quaint cultural practice which should be tolerated in the UK?
Absolutely not.
So why not?
Because we, well, it's against the law for a start.
Law schmore. I mean, who decides how the law will be upheld or enforced or whatever?
Well, you see, it can be right and wrong. You, with cultural relativism, you can get away with everything.
I mean, the girls that have been raped, who have been interviewed, have been told by the perpetrators of this that the perpetrators are right to do this because they are Muslim men and they are claiming these women, and the women deserve it, or the girls deserve it, because they are not Muslim girls and they are basically rubbish. So the Muslim men are actually have an ethical right to it. You know, they're actually doing something right on behalf of Islam by, if you like, conquering these girls. I may not be representing it precisely accurately, but there is definitely a kind of component like that to it. So you could argue on a cultural relativistic point of view that actually the Muslim men are doing right. In which case, who are we to gainsay that?
Well, no. Well, first of all, if it was right, it wouldn't be rape.
No, which is why it's grooming, not rape. They call it grooming gangs.
Yeah.
It's like the hairdresser's circle from Rochdale.
Well, yes. No, I'm sorry. It's...
But why not?
Well, would they accept it the other way round?
Of course not.
Right.
But that doesn't bother them in the least. I mean, they have the right of conquest, the right to enslave their conquered peoples, the right to plunder in battle, all these things. You know, these are ancient Islamic rights. And they regard Jews and Christians as having no rights except to be the slaves of Muslims. You know, that's the Islamic worldview.
Yeah.
But why is that wrong? I mean, why not? If you're living in Saudi Arabia, you just knuckle down, put up with it. Why shouldn't Saudi Arabia simply conquer the world and turn it all to Islam?
Well, what they're saying is might is right, aren't they?
There's a component to that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, part of it is just because we can.
Yeah.
But it's not entirely that. There is also, you know, the Quranic, you know, pietistic apologetic for it as well. I mean, I would argue that in this country, we are not an Islamic country. Therefore, whatever Islamic cultural mores might be practiced in Islamic countries, they are not acceptable here if they act in any way contravene our ancient laws and customs, which are rooted and grounded in Christianity. And that within the boundaries of this land, all our laws apply to everyone, irrespective of their background. Therefore, they must obey our laws since they live in this country. Therefore, they should be prosecuted with all the rigor of law for the vile crimes which they've perpetrated. And that anyone that in some way undermines or opposes that is guilty of collusion with vile and heinous acts of cruelty and horrible misuse of these young girls. That's my own take on it. I don't care where they're from. These deeds are not acceptable. I don't care who's doing it. they are doing vile and disgusting things and deserve all the rigors of prosecution. Frankly, I'm surprised there hasn't been an outcry, haven't been vigilante, actions against them, because what they're doing is so vile and so disgusting. It's so depraved and so horrible. I'm astonished at the broad tolerance, not just of the legal system and the social services, but also the population as a whole. And the fact that only people like Tommy Robinson speak against it and then get prosecuted makes me feel there's something horribly wrong with the whole legal system. But to my mind, I'm crystal clear about it. This is our land. These are our laws. Therefore, within the land, you obey our laws. But I would actually argue that within our land, because of the objectivity of the revelation of God, that Christianity should be privileged over other religions. That therefore other religions can be practiced in private. We're not going to compel people to be Christians, which would be foolish. We're not going to infringe their privacy by interfering with them at home, as according to our ancient customs. But neither are we going to tolerate vile and despicable acts. So if they want to eat weird foods in the privacy of their own homes, then they're perfectly free to do so. But for example, if they want to become part of public life, then they must fit in with public life as we understand it. So there.
So you can believe what you like, but you can't do what you like.
Precisely. And there we are. Anyway, the next slide that came up was moral disengagement. The idea that something is wrong and you can somehow explain it away to yourself even, as well as to anyone else. So do you remember the content of this video?
They're just mind games, aren't they? That you yourself.
What would be, if you like, what's kind of cautionary about that?
It's a bit of a slippery slope.
Certainly could be.
Yeah.
Why is it good to actually be aware of this idea of moral disengagement?
It brings up a blind spot in your moral thinking.
Absolutely, yeah. It highlights your blind spot. Yeah. So it really requires self-awareness. And you need to be conscious of this, I think. So when you catch yourself doing it, you can say, hang on, what am I doing? What am I explaining away here? There we are. And conflict of interest. Well, Did you know that the medicine regulatory bodies in the UK are funded by pharmacological companies?
Oh, it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
Does that seem a conflict of interest?
Absolutely.
Massively. I was astounded when I discovered that. I can't think of a more grotesque conflict of interest as possible. I mean, it's like having the courts funded by organized crime. I mean, anyway, coffee break. Do you want to have a comfort break?
No, I'm good.
So moral cognition. And this is really C.S. Lewis's point in The Abolition of Man and Mere Christianity. What does it mean to think morally, ethically? Is it coded in God, genetics, the brain, the body, the soul, or society? And it begs the question, what do all those things mean? So let's begin with society. Do morals or ethics necessarily come from society?
Yes. But then also the society is built upon the morals. So you've got let's pick on Christianity. We've got Christianity built the society. The society then extends Christian morals.
So it's a bit of a hen and egg thing there.
Self-supporting, I think I would use rather there.
Can society function without morals or ethics?
No.
I think you're right there.
Not at all. Even Nazism had a queer sort of ethics,
Absolutely, yeah.
and that went down the toilet rather rapidly.
But to bring it more opposite, communist states, which still exist in some parts of the world and have existed until comparatively recently, had an ethic.
Yeah.
I mean, you might argue that the whole of communism was built upon an ethical vision.
Yes, yes.
But I'd argue that it's a deeply flawed ethical vision.
A godless one. Yeah.
Yeah, which
I
I
mean,
think is why it necessarily fails, because it is deliberately godless.
yeah. I mean, it sounded all right on paper, didn't it? Was it, what was one of their strap lines? Everybody according to their ability, everything according to their need. It all sounds good. And then when you look at it, oh dear.
Well, it says, who states ability? How do you describe ability? What defines need? Who
Well,
states need? Who adjudicates need?
this is where it all rapidly falls apart.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah. One thing which I had a curious conversation this morning, actually. I was with two of my colleagues, and they were very despondent about Trump. And they were talking about it, which in ways I thought was actually worrying in itself. And I don't mind people disliking Trump or criticizing it, but they described it as the rise of fascism, as in the 30s. So I said, hang on, this isn't the same thing at all. Hang on. No. And then they backtracked. They said, no, we're not about to see death camps. And I didn't really have a chance to pursue the conversation further, but if you invoke the rise of fascism in the 30s and then say, but we're not about to have death camps, so what precisely do you mean by the rise of fascism? Because the rise of fascism in the 30s precisely went to death camps. And you're invoking that language, which invokes the same sense of horror and repulsion, which you're building the same sense of utter condemnation for Trump. You're making a very, very derogatory comparison with Trump, with Hitler and with Mussolini and with various other reprehensible characters. And then you pull back and say, well, we're not going to death camps. So I think, well, where are you going then? What do you mean by fascism then? And as I was thinking about it today, one thing, Mussolini was a communist, a socialist, and the word fascism comes from his writing. He's the one that actually invented the word. He got the word the fasci from the ancient Roman bundle of sticks, signifying unity or strength through unity. And his kind of motto was the collective is everything, the individual is nothing. So it was a socialist collectivization of Italy, was his vision, was his fascism. And then Hitler designed National Socialism. It's called socialism. That's the word he used. And it is a variety, a brand, an interpretation of socialism. It is a socialism based on the nation state. And one thing that Hitler and Mussolini both had in common was a very statist view. It's about the state, about the collective, it's about the people, but it's also about a totalitarian ideology. And of course, the communists were also socialists and also statists with a totalitarian ideology. And I don't see Trump being either statist or totalitarian in his ideology. I see him being pretty arbitrary. He throws his weight around, he shoots his mouth off. But I don't see statism there, and I don't really see totalitarianism there either. He's pretty loose knit, in most respects. A bit like Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was kind of chaotic. He wasn't a totalitarian by any stretch of the imagination. And when world leaders during the COVID crisis were lapping up the opportunity to give themselves extraordinary powers and basically dictatorial powers, arbitrary powers of governance, the drop of a hat, Johnson seemed to be deeply reluctant to take on that role. So if you like, Johnson seemed to me to be almost an anti-totalitarian, a kind of anti-fascist, if anything. And then you ask, well, where now do you get dogmatic ideology? If you're looking for fascism now, where are you finding the dogmatic ideology? Where's it coming from? Who is intolerant of dissent? Who wishes to crush opposition? Who wishes to silence criticism? Who wishes to stifle debate?
It's old Vladimirovich Putin.
Well, Putin certainly like that, yeah, but he's just a dictator.
Yeah.
He's a personality cult, really.
Hmm.
But no, I was thinking the kind of transgenderism, for example, that definitely has a very dogmatic approach. It has no interest in dissent. It will not tolerate any kind of contradiction. It will not allow any kind of discourse. It simply makes its assertions and seeks to overpower opposition and impose its will. So that's the totalitarian mentality at work. Anyway, what about the soul then? What actually is the soul?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I don't know what it is.
But we do know that if God is morally good and God has created the soul and the brain and the whole body, then we have the ability to be morally good.
But is that the soul, or is that some other component of our nature?
That's a good question, because I don't see it being much difference. Because if we're going to be disembodied souls, there wouldn't be bodily resurrection.
Precisely, yeah.
Which actually moves on to AI, because aren't they having problems with it not being in a body? I did read somewhere.
Oh, I hadn't read that. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, if I can dig it out, I'll send it if I can remember it. But
Yeah.
one of the problems they've got with AI is because it's not embodied, it's having problems existing. And I thought, hello, that sounds familiar to us, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in the Bible, there's a word in the Old Testament translated as soul, which is nephesh. And in the New Testament, that same word is translated as psyche or psyche. But in both of them, it seems to mean simply the state of being not dead. So when it says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul," it's not talking to, if you like, a separate component. It's saying, "Bless the Lord, O my life." Now, that which is in me, which is alive, bless the Lord. What about the whole body?
I would say the whole body includes the soul. I mean, Descartes split them up, and he couldn't put them back together again, could he?
No. Is it sensible to talk about a body without a soul, or a soul without a body?
No. Well, I suppose there's a dead body. I suppose if you did that, but a living
is a dead body a person?
No.
I agree completely. I agree. It's nonsensical to speak of a body without a soul or a soul without a body. It's a bit like it doesn't really exist. You know, a person is a body and a soul. You know, it's a living body. So what about the brain? The physiology of the brain?
Just a modified organ.
Yeah, well, it's part of the body.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of nonsensical, really, to speak of a brain without a body, in that the brain is part of the body. So in a science fiction novel I read called The Old Man's War, they managed to technologically support a brain without a body. But the interesting thing was, the implication of the novel was that the brain was part of a body and could only function because it was part of a body. Therefore, if, for example, if you have a body and then you lose a foot, you can have a prosthetic foot. Hypothetically, a brain in a bottle is a brain in a prosthetic body. But hypothetically, it's still part of a body, even if most of the body is now absent. The actual tissue of the brain is part of the body, which makes it basically part of the body. And to my mind, the genetics likewise, they're simply part of the body. You can't separate genetics from the body. If you simply take DNA, for example, a strand of DNA doesn't actually do anything or mean anything on its own. If you take a living cell is only a living cell because it has DNA and it has cellular machinery made of coded proteins, and it has a cell structure, and it has a cell membrane. And all those four, if you like, areas of cell need to be present and correct before the cell is alive. But if the cell actually lacks any one of those four things, it won't function as a cell. It simply dies, in which case it's not a cell anymore. It's just a bit of mush. So it's nonsensical then to speak of genetics as being separate from basically the body, in that a living cell is simply either a complete body in a monocellular organism or a part of a body in the case of everything else. So I read a very interesting book recently about molecular biology, and it was talking about the information. And DNA, as you're probably aware, contains a vast amount of information. One thing I didn't really realize, or which I hadn't really kind of clocked, was the fact that the protein machinery around DNA also contains a vast amount of information, in that each protein is specific, and each protein is a specific combination of amino acids arranged in a specific order and folded in a specific way so as to create a specific shape for its specific purpose. And if any one of those things isn't right, it doesn't work and the cell dies. But that actually, if you like, does stuff in the cell, including processing the DNA. But the actual structure of the cell is separate again from the protein machinery. And the structure of the cell contains even more information. And outside on the surface of the cell is the membrane, which contains even more information, which is, again, is absolutely specific. So if you actually take the DNA out of a cell, if you take the nucleus out of a cell, so in other words, you've taken out two layers of information, the DNA and the protein machinery, it will actually replicate for a while based on the information it's got in the cell membrane and the cell structure. After a certain amount of divisions, it will then stop replicating because it comes to a point where it actually needs the information of the nucleus. And at that point, it then dies. So yeah, I found it very interesting just how specific all that information was, how vast the quantity of it was, and how totally integrated it is. So you can't speak of genetics, the brain or the body or the soul really separately from each other. They're all one and the same. And without that, they simply don't work. They're meaningless. So what about God?
What about him?
What does God have to do with morals or ethics?
Well, he's basically the lawgiver, isn't he?
Yep. So if you say he's the lawgiver, what does that say about God himself?
A moral agent.
Yeah. Yeah. And what does that say about creation?
That it is good, that it is very good.
Yeah. And and if God is the lawgiver and creation is good, what does that say about ethics and morals?
Well, if they've come from God, then they are also good.
Yep. If they've come from God.
Yeah. And you might learn more about being a good person walking around the world than you would be staying in a courtroom.
If hypothetically God is good, or at least if God is creator and God is the lawgiver, that would suggest then that the way that the lawgiver made things would be integrated into the way the things are made,
Mhm.
which would suggest then that ethics and morals are actually part of the fabric of creation.
Yes.
And therefore, that the quality of wisdom is the quality of being able to discern that part of creation which is ethical and moral. Therefore, one would expect, if that was so, that people, irrespective of their background, would have some perception of this aspect of creation.
I think they have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that provides an explanation as to why they have.
Mm.
So, in other words, it's not a neo-Darwinistic evolutionary development, and it's not an arbitrary social development, and nor it is a selfish development. It's simply the way things are because that's how they're made. And it actually provides, to my mind, a very satisfying explanation as to why they're that way and why they make sense. But conversely, if that is so, then one would expect then, if the way that the creation is made includes moral and ethical qualities, because that's how God made them, you would expect us not only to be able to perceive them then and to appreciate them and to understand them, you'd also expect, therefore, us to benefit from them. Conversely, then, to act immorally or unethically, you would expect to be harmful, objectively harmful. And to be moral and ethical, you'd expect to be objectively beneficial. Because that's how things are. That's the fabric of creation. Is that idea vindicated? Empirically, if you observe things around, does that seem to make sense?
That is the age-old question. Why do bad people flourish? I think it's a psalm for that. I can't remember which one.
37.
So you say, yeah. But in the end, people do get their comeuppance.
Well, that's the Hindu principle of karma, isn't it?
Yeah, but then you've got to have God then to judge what's good and bad.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You can't get off the bus.
If hypothetically what I've said is true, therefore, for example, if you take sex, sex I think is unusual in that, unlike most activities, sex has an innately moral component to it, in that you can eat most things without morally compromising yourself. The only immoral aspect of food really is immoderate greed, immoderate appetite, or immoderate fastidiousness or something. In excessive preoccupation or demanding aspects of food or diet or something. But broadly speaking, it doesn't really matter what you eat. If it's not bad, if it's not rotten or putrid, then it's okay. Just eat it, whether you like it or not. It's all grist to the mill, it's all fuel for the fire. But mostly the only moral aspect of it is whether you're grateful to God for it. Whether you're thankful for your food. But with sex, it is simply wrong to have sex with one with whom one is not married. It is immoral. It is definitively immoral to have sex with one who is not one's marital partner. Therefore, is it innately harmful to have sex with someone with whom one is not married?
Well, the consequences of it could be difficult.
There are, of course, consequences. There's STDs and unwanted pregnancies. And of course, if you are married, then you have the consequence of enraged spouses.
Well, yes.
But assuming that you've got away with it on all those fronts, assuming you haven't got the clap, you haven't knocked someone up, and your other half either doesn't know, doesn't care, or you haven't got another half, is there injury or harm simply by having sex with someone with whom one is not married? Oh, take an example. There's that girl recently who rather notoriously had 1,000 men over 24 hours. Now, to put it most charitably, she could only have been married to one of them. So she had at least 999 to whom she was not married.
Yeah.
Has she harmed herself?
Yes.
In what way? How?
She's not going to look back on that with any pride in a couple of years' time.
No, but that's the question. Why not? You know, if he had simply, for example, gone bowling and done 1,000 bowls in 24 hours, would you be proud of that?
But I'm not doing something that is intimate beyond belief.
If the body is simply the vehicle of I don't know, authenticity. If one's authentic self is to shag around, is she simply being authentic to herself by sleeping with or having sex with 1,000 men?
Yes, she's been authentic to herself, but that doesn't actually mean anything. Because you're not supposed to be being authentic to oneself is we're back to Kant and trying to create morals out of nothing.
I would personally say that she has harmed herself. I think she's actually degraded herself quite considerably. I think she would actually be debilitated by that. I think she is emotionally and psychologically and morally harmed. I mean, she was quite sore afterwards as well, physical, but the physical pain, well, I think passed quite quickly and is a really little consequence. But the moral degradation, the degradation of her soul, her spirit, of her personhood, and you know, if she ever comes to conscience about that, she'll be so filled with revulsion of that. She'll be so utterly appalled at what she's done. But it begs the question, well, what harm has she actually done to herself in the meantime? You know, until she actually has that awakening of conscience, you know, what actually has become of her? You know, if you saw her before and after, would you see a change in her? I kind of thinking you would. I don't think she's the same person she was beforehand. You know, I think she has objectively harmed herself because it is innately immoral. Now, what she has done is simply immoral. And to do immorality of that magnitude, I'm certain that she's injured herself. I can't see how she's escaped injury. It's assuming she hasn't got the clap and hasn't got knocked up and he hasn't got some enraged other half banging her on the door. You know, simply the fact she's done it, I think, is a self-injury. So there we go. And I think that's because God made us that way. There we go. So let's move on. Humanism, anthropocentrism, speciesism, dualism, modernism, transhumanism, posthumanism. Did you see this little cartoon thing, this little film?
Yes, yes.
It's bizarre, isn't it? There's been a number of science fiction things based on that, actually. There was Battlestar Galactica. Did you ever see that series on TV?
I saw the old one.
Well, the new series actually was very well written. Thoroughly recommend it. It's 5 series, and then there's an epilogue series that came afterwards. And in the epilogue series, they actually deal with this idea of uploading a mind into an electronic component. And that's basically the origin of the Cylons. It's these minds uploaded into electronic components, and therefore having a life away from the original body. They became an intelligence outside a body. And it was the desire to return to their bodies that actually motivated the whole Cylon quest. First the cloning of the bodies and then the efforts to reproduce. And there's 2 science fiction novels, interestingly, which did this kind of taking the mind from the body thing. One of them was Old Man's War by John Scalzi, in which case I found it very interesting because in his book, the mind can be transferred from one body to another, but it has to have identical DNA. The brain is formed by the genetics and the information of that living body, and the brain and the mind as a waveform can only inhabit a specific genetic brain. In the other one, David Morgan's book, Altered Carbon, the mind can be uploaded into a chip, and that chip can then be implanted into any body whatsoever, irrespective. And it's interesting the kind of differences, how that worked out, how that kind of taking those 2 hypotheses, it kind of worked out in real life. Because in the Scalzi one, it is completely anchored, therefore, in the body. The mind, therefore, is necessarily embodied. Whereas in the other one, the mind is not necessarily embodied. Therefore, the mind can have a completely separate existence without any body whatsoever. It can have a purely virtual electronic existence without involving a body. And the mind can therefore be sent electronically. So it's a lot cheaper to travel that way. So, and more convenient. But that's the kind of 2 approaches to the kind of transhumanism question. And then the other aspect of transhumanism is the idea that somehow you could put your brain into a fridge and keep it indefinitely until the technology arises to reconstitute your body. There we are. Is this wholesome, do you think?
It's our mortality that defines me. I think it's just, well, I don't think it'll ever happen. So, but no, I think it's just, we'll be degraded.
Do you think the fact that people are thinking like this, do you think it's a good thing?
If you're writing a science fiction novel, why not? But for the rest of us, no.
Why not?
Well, because this girl says that she wants to become Data.
Yeah.
So she doesn't want to feel anymore. Love.
We don't know. I mean, she might feel something as a data cloud. I don't know.
I doubt it. What, love, shame, happiness? No.
The virtual experiences of these things.
No. I think we're not just a collection of facts.
Why do you think then? 1, why do you think someone would want to think that? 2, what's wrong with them thinking that?
Well, they're wrong. But
why are they wrong?
That's not what it is to be human.
And what is it to be human?
Well, as I say, feeling, suffering, everything.
I'd actually put it much more basically that I'd say to be human is to be embodied.
Well, we're back to what I said earlier. Yeah.
So I would say that the way to offset this trend in thinking is to emphasize embodiment, to being human. Being human is necessarily being embodied. Therefore, encourage people to be in their bodies.
Yes, because that's the thing with the bodily resurrection. Why?
Because that's what we are. We are bodies.
Exactly. I mean, it'd be a lot easier if we were just floating about on the clouds. But
or in the cloud, as she puts it.
Not cloud, no. So there must be something essential in us,
Yeah.
the body.
I would argue personally that the divine image in which we are made includes our body. That is necessarily part of us. Therefore, necessarily, we as human beings, made in the image of God, men and women, are embodied. That's what we are. And that's why I'm almost actually reluctant to use the word human, in that human implies somehow you can be human without being either male or female or not in a body. And actually, that's, I think, a misapprehension. I don't think it's possible to be that. Therefore, I think it'd be better to say men or women rather than human, because that's what we are. Either we are men or we are women. You can't be a human that's neither male nor female. You're either one or the other. You may like it or not. You might enjoy it or not. You might be good at it or not, but that's what you are. You know, some men just aren't very good at being manly. Never mind. Doesn't mean they're not men, though, does it? So, if you're going to offset this transhumanism, post-humanism trend, and I'd suggest that one reason for this trend arising, you know, even speculatively, is because people are becoming less, if you like, bound by their physical nature. There's less and less emphasis on where food comes from, for example, or the experience of physical work, or the necessity of procreation, or any of these really biological things. And so people are free, basically, to become deluded. You know, if you order in your food from a delivery service and you spend all your time online, you know, your actual bodily presence isn't really important, is it? You know, it's your
No.
interaction online, which is by whatever interface you use. But if, on the other hand, you insist on mixing with real people, if you garden, if you dig in the garden, if you take exercise and get hot and sweaty, if you fast and you get hungry, if you become thirsty and you drink and you really appreciate the sensation, if you get cold and you shiver, if you get warm and you want to cool off, you know, all these very basic bodily experiences actually ground you in reality. Whereas if you de-emphasize all those things, if you never really feel hungry or thirsty or tired or cold or hot, you can kind of forget you've even got a body. So it's kind of curious that when the children were small, the school bus in our village used to actually drive past our gate. And I thought, well, no, I'm not going to have my kids just roll out of bed straight onto the bus. My children are going to walk to school. So I got them up early, having two small girls. My wife was working and I was off sick, so I had to learn how to do plaits and polish paint and shoes and do all these things with little girls. But I made them walk to the top of the village to meet the bus every morning, rain or shine, winter or summer. We'd go up first thing in the morning, we'd walk to the top of the hill outside the village, and there we'd meet the bus. And they'd stand in the pouring rain if it was raining, they'd stand in the freezing wind if it was windy, they'd stand in the blazing sun if it was sunny. But they used their legs. Their legs got tired at times. They got hot sometimes, they got wet sometimes, they got cold sometimes. But to my mind, that is absolutely right and proper, because that's what their legs are for. Their legs are there in order to get tired when they're walking, you know, up a hill. That's what they're meant to do. You know, and the whole point of having skin is so that you feel the sun and the rain and the snow and the wind on it. What else have you got skin for? You know, and a lot of children just didn't do that. You know, they just didn't experience that. And I really think they're deprived. I think those children have really solidly lost out on something. They just didn't spend a lot of time outdoors. I think there's something actually quite profound about that. You know, I think the actual physical experience of being in the mud, of being sweaty, of being hot, of being tired, of being cold, of being hungry, thirsty, all these things, it's being human, it's being physical, which is what we are. And I think we neglect that at our peril. So there. Right. AI. Did you see that thing I sent out? That little thing about AI?
I don't think so. I've forgotten.
It was a Times Radio thing about AI being used in Ukraine's war effort. It's talking about the applications of AI, and it was quite a good, concise explanation of the different ways in which AI is used. So, for example, if there's a missile strike and like 100 missiles are flying, AI, some kind of analytical engine can monitor the trajectory of the missiles and try and work out which ones need to be shot down and which ones could be safely ignored. And it can do that kind of processing quicker than a human analysis would normally do it by observation. So, AI can be very handy for that kind of thing. But I think the problem with AI is what actually we mean by AI. What do you think it means?
I don't think there's a proper definition of it.
Not really, no.
No.
What does AI do then? I mean, in daily life now, what would you expect? How would you expect to encounter it?
Oh, when you buy something on Amazon, it says people have bought this, also bought this.
Right. Do you think that's it's reasonable? Is that a okay thing to do?
Well, they're there to make a profit. They're not saying that you should buy it. And after all, if you didn't want Amazon to know what you're going to buy, then you wouldn't buy it from them, would you?
No.
So I don't think I've ever bought anything they've recommended, but no.
How about other times when you must have come across AI?
Oh, the same with YouTube as well, isn't it? But then you can play with that, can't you? You end up with some very strange things.
What about if you say to Alexa something, and then next time you log into Facebook, you see an advert that seems to be related to what you said to Alexa?
Alexa doesn't live here.
I actually, my daughter went overseas and left us her Alexa, and I find it quite irritating, but my wife quite likes it. But so I once said, Alexa, are you a retard? And another time I said, Alexa, are you eavesdropping? And interestingly, when I said that, I got this thing about the data privacy confidentiality thing from Amazon. Because, of course, Alexa is eavesdropping.
Yeah.
And that's basically the fact of it. Alexa is eavesdropping. It is eavesdropping because it's not a she, it's a thing.
Yeah.
All it ever is. So, yeah, there we are. But you get generative AI. Have you seen these AI clips on YouTube? Like movie trailers.
Oh, yeah. Is it about old films?
Well, they'll say take Harry Potter in Russia. AI generated trailer. You're Russian, Harry. Drink vodka. And you can tell it's AI in that there's odd discontinuities with it. But some of them I think are very funny. Some of them are very witty, But what they've done is they've taken a video generating program, they've given it certain cues and information, and the AI has then assembled a kind of trailer out of the cues and information it's been given. Of course, the AI can only do that because it's been given instructions. So in that respect, AI is just like any other instrument of creativity, in that it's only as good as the instructions you're going to give it. It can do things quickly. So, for example, it can produce an animated clip in a fraction of the time it would take a human animator to do it. But it's only acting according to instructions. So if you give it lousy instructions, it'll come up with a lousy product. If you give it good instructions, it'll come up with something interesting. So from that point of view, AI is going to change the film industry in that they can do things quickly. They can use it as a shortcut, which means that the craftsmen who previously did the long work will now be out of a job. But it's not going to suddenly make films different, in that the actual films that are made are still going to be the product of human decisions. And the quality of those decisions will define the quality of the output. So in that respect, it's back to square one. On one level, it's going to actually be a great enabler, in that it means that comparatively modest studios with a modest budget can now produce film where previously it might be more expensive. So it means, in theory, there could be a great outpouring of creativity with all kinds of people coming up with all kinds of ideas and being able to publish them on YouTube or, free access sites like that. So this could be a really good stimulus for filmmaking. But of course, it's going to shake up the established studio, film production companies and TV production companies, because they're going to have to now adapt to a new changing landscape with great speed. But that's generative AI. Whereas when you've got the adverts on Facebook, that's obviously a different kind of AI, isn't it? And then if you've got a missile system that's trying to identify the threats to your power infrastructure, then that's obviously a different kind of AI. So obviously it's a tool which can be used in a different wide variety of applications, some of which are comparatively innocuous. I heard about one man who integrated his house. I think he integrated all the control mechanisms for his house, including the front door key. And he had an Amazon delivery, and the person that made the delivery said something which the AI monitoring the door interpreted as a racist remark, which he then interpreted as a remark made by the owner of the house. Therefore, the owner of the house has now branded a racist and reported to Amazon, and he was locked out of his own house. Now, to my mind, you see, the problem there is not AI. The problem there is the stupidity of the person that set up his house in a way that could lock him out. Yeah. What kind of moron does that? So to my mind, the biggest problem with AI is the problem of entrusting to it things that it's simply not competent to do. Misunderstanding what it does and what it doesn't do. And I think that is the biggest threat of AI. As technology, it's simply a neutral tool. It will just do what you do with it according to the skill or the decisions of the user, which may be malignant, which may be creative, which may be beneficial or whatever. But the biggest threat, I think actually is misunderstanding it, simply not using it appropriately. In the Battlestar Galactica, they had this great pejorative word for Cylons. They used to call them toasters. Because, of course, they look like robots and they're chromey, shiny bits, a bit like toasters. But, of course, it's a derogatory word because a toaster is about the most basic machine you could think of, isn't it? It's got a timer and a heating element and a spring, and it just pops up and down. It's got no capacity within it to do anything much more. So, within that context, to call it a toaster is quite derogatory. It's making a very low-grade claim against them, saying you're simply a machine discharging obligations. But actually, that's what it is, isn't it? It is simply a machine doing something which is told to do. It may as well be a lawnmower. That's all it is. So how can AI have rights if it's simply a lawnmower or a toaster?
Well, it's not embodied in anything, is it? Really?
Well, it can be embodied in a computer or a lawnmower or a toaster.
Yeah, but look, well, perhaps we should have rights for toasters. Yeah.
white bread on Sundays.
Absolutely, yes.
Oh, there we go. Anyway, ethical AI. So these are the codes of AI. Now, this is where I think is quite practical. What do you think of all this?
I think that was just a word salad. All they said is, it should be this, it should be that, it must be this, it must be that. Who's going to police it? We're back to rights again.
Well, who's going to police it? That is the big, fat, hairy question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think, as principles, these are reasonable principles?
It's a good start.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know. What about Asimov's laws of robotics? I mean, you could have thrown them in there, couldn't they?
Yeah. Did you ever see that film, I, Robot?
No, no.
Because the whole plot twist in that was that the laws of robotics have been interpreted by the intelligence to understand the intelligent, the kind of mainframe realized that human beings were basically self-destructive, and therefore that the law of robotics to prevent human beings from coming to harm meant that actually the robots had to kidnap and imprison the humans for their own safety. So yeah, it's about like the man locking himself out of his own house, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you do that to children, don't you? You don't let them run free. Toddlers, you put the stair gate on so they don't fall downstairs.
Yeah. But what changes then? Why do you take the stairgate away?
Well, when they're old enough to negotiate the stairs.
On one level, that's a purely physical thing.
Yeah.
But there's an implicit non-physical thing.
Well, you'd also know the fact that once they've fallen downstairs the first time, they won't do it again because they will fall downstairs. It's about that.
But in theory, the principle you're talking about is that children don't really know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And when they reach their age of majority, you might call it the age of moral majority. It means that they're now considered morally accountable, morally responsible. Therefore, if someone of 15 does something stupid and wicked, you can say they're not fully culpable because they're not fully actually morally culpable, because they're not fully morally responsible because they're not actually fully grown up. So whilst it may be reprehensible and they may have some idea of reprehensibility, they're not considered adults, therefore not subject to the full rigors of adult prosecution. But once someone is 18, for example, they're considered to be morally responsible. It's interesting, actually, that when it comes to it, say in men's sport, you have the under 19s, you have the under 21s, and you have the under 25s. And it's only really when a man turns 25 he's really in the mainstream, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So you might say from a physical point of view, men are only in their full majority in their mid-20s. But the question is, it used to be, of course, that people were not considered fully grown up until they're 21, wasn't it? There's the 21st birthday used to be the big one.
Yeah.
In other words, young men and women of 18 or 19 were considered childish. Which I agree with, actually. I've observed a few.
Just look around.
Having been one of mine once. So, yeah, when does someone become fully morally responsible? When are they fully accountable?
It's different for everybody. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
But we've got to put a marker somewhere. If there was some sort of test, then, put a computer to somebody's brain and sort it out, then it would be great. But you can't.
No. There we are. So, moral agents. Are animals moral agents? Are children moral agents?
Well, just back to what we just said earlier.
Yeah, quite. I personally don't think animals are moral agents. I think if a lion bites you, it's just because it's a lion. It's not because it's being wicked. It's being inconvenient, but
Well,
it's
yeah,
not actually being evil.
yeah.
So my wife went out camping. She's brought up in Rhodesia, and she went out camping on a school trip, and a lion came and killed and ate one of the girls on her camping trip.
Oh dear. Yeah.
Now, it's a pretty unpleasant thing to happen. It's pretty horrible. But I don't say that that lion was morally evil. It was just a lion being a lion. I say just, I mean, it's pretty horrible.
Yeah.
But that's what it was. Now, I'd argue that if a lion gets in the habit of killing and eating people, it's a good idea to shoot the lion because that's not a habit you want to encourage. But I wouldn't argue that you're doing it because the animal is evil. I'd argue that you're doing it because the animal has got a very, very inconvenient taste for human flesh, which is harmful to the community. And therefore, in the interest of the well-being of the community, you need to protect it by killing the lion. And that therefore, to kill the lion, you might say, not just is morally permissible, I'd say it's almost morally required. But that's not because the lion's evil. I'd say the lion is basically neutral. Its existence is good. It's a good thing that lions exist, but lions are not capable of goodness per se. Or correlatory, they're not capable of evil either. They're just lions. They're jolly nice. I mean, I like lions. I've got nothing against them. It's just that that's what they are. So, and I'd argue the reason that we are moral agents is because we're made in the image of God. And I'd argue that our moral sensibility, therefore, our moral agency is not contingent upon our rationality. It's contingent upon our humanity, on our creation. So that means a thick person is just as morally culpable as an intelligent one.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So I would actually suggest, because the issue of soul came up earlier, I would suggest actually, because the Bible uses two words, it uses soul and spirit. And I personally have a kind of working hypothesis that angels and demons are spiritual beings, and that humans, men and women, are also spiritual, but we're embodied and spiritual. But that our moral nature is dictated by the fact we are spiritual in nature. That spiritual things are necessarily morally charged. Therefore, angels are intrinsically good or evil. Either they are demons, which are evil, or they are angels, which are good. There is no such thing as a neutral angel or demon. Whereas you can have a neutral body in that a lion is just a lion. It's neutral, it's morally neutral, because it doesn't have a spirit. So it lacks the moral quality or the moral agency that human men and women and angels and demons do have. I noticed that angels and demons didn't come up in this
No.
so far. But they are necessarily, I think, part of the biblical worldview. So do animals have moral worth? That's a completely different question.
Well, yes. Yes, they have worth, don't they?
Yeah, I think so.
Moral agents, there's a difference from being moral worth. Yes, they're being. I mean, just because you don't like or do like, if you don't like lions, doesn't mean you should wipe them all out. You know, people like them, people don't like them. They're just there, aren't they?
So to take that further, what is the worth of a lion?
You could say that it's been created by God and it is good, not morally good, but good in itself.
Yeah, I go with that.
Yeah.
In other words, its existence is good because God made it.
Yeah.
There is a goodness about its existence.
And if it wasn't good, he probably would have made it.
That's right. So therefore, if we caused lions to be extinct, would that be an evil thing?
Well, you are destroying something that God considers good, so that would be wrong.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. So I'd agree, I would actually say that it's a moral evil to cause the extinction of something whose existence is actually innately good.
Hmm.
Is it the same to do it deliberately or accidentally?
Um, well, if we the consequences would be the same, but if we didn't do it with malice, I it would be a shame, and we should do everything to stop it. But if it was absolute accident, I don't think it'd be as bad as if we set out to eradicate lions.
Yeah.
If, for example, I don't know, we created a bug and it just killed lions, but we were just doing it to, I don't know, kill malaria. There we are then.
So to take an analogous example, cane toads were imported into Australia to control some of the pests in sugar plantations.
Hmm.
They've since proved to be a pest around Australia, and they've proliferated enormously and proved very hard to deal with. Is there something intrinsically wrong with what people have done by introducing cane toads to Australia?
Yes, we know now that's bad.
Why is it bad? What precisely is the badness of it?
You could you could say that God's created the world in balance, and we're upsetting it slightly by introducing things that we shouldn't.
So is it evil, for example, that we've introduced sheep to Britain?
No.
Is it necessary to introduce sheep to Britain? If, for
Sorry.
example, we decided we'd had enough of them and simply exterminated sheep from Britain, would that be an evil thing?
Well, there are sheep everywhere else.
There are cane toads outside Australia.
Yeah. So if we decided we wanted to get rid of the sheep, I don't think that would be an evil.
No.
Lamb would go down in price.
So if how's it going to say? What about the red squirrels? Red squirrels have been vastly diminished by grey squirrels. Would there be anything wrong if we simply obliterated the last red squirrels?
The red squirrels? No, that would be wrong. Yes, they're here. God put them here. I don't think it's our right to wipe them out.
If we obliterated the grey squirrels from the land, would that be wrong?
The American grey squirrels from Britain?
Yeah.
Well, there are plenty in America.
Yeah. So would you suggest then that there is something intrinsically wholesome about having red squirrels in Britain, and that Britain does not require sheep, and basically because that's how God made it?
Well, you could argue that there weren't humans in Britain once upon a time. We can't all go back to the savannah, can we?
That's not exactly the same question, because if we invoke a theological argument, of course, the theological premise of humans is to fill the earth and subdue it.
Yes, yes.
So therefore, we have every right to be in every place.
Yeah.
Point of view.
And we need something to eat. and something to wear. So bring along the sheep.
No, I think that's an interesting line of reasoning, though, because if you reason that animals have worth simply because God made them and put them there, then you could argue that cane toads in their proper environment have worth, but cane toads in Australia do not have worth because they're a pest. They're vermin.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's no evil thing to destroy cane toads from America because there they are a vermin and God did not put them there. Whereas in their own home environment, they're not vermin. They are simply part of the natural ecology, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
So therefore, if, for example, we decided to rewild portions of Britain, so we'd therefore exterminate the invasive species such as sheep and grey squirrels, and then restored the native species, the ones that would be here if we hadn't previously exterminated them, such as the wolverine, the lynx, the bear, the wolf, the roe deer and red deer, already plentiful. Would that be a good thing?
I don't think bringing back bears would be a good thing.
No?
No. I wouldn't like to go wandering around the wood and encounter a bear.
I'd quite like it, actually. I think one thing I feel quite kind of sanguine about this is because I've been around South Africa and Zimbabwe quite a bit, and there's quite a lot of wild animals there. And some of them are, you might say, truly wild, and they just do what they like. Like leopards, for example, are practically impossible to control. They just go wherever they want. There's no fence that's going to keep a leopard in or out of anything. They simply climb over it. And but you get, say, I stayed in a park, 20,000 hectares. It's fairly big, but not like mind-bogglingly big, not impossibly big. But it's about 20,000 hectare estate, which was made by merging together, I think, 5 or 6 farms. And they then cleared out all the fields and then rewilded it, let all the natural vegetation grow back, planted trees and woodland and built a couple of dams, all that kind of thing. And then built resorts on it and then stocked it with animals. Now, from that point of view, it's a completely artificial environment. This is not natural wilderness that is being preserved as a natural wilderness. This is farmland that has been turned into a kind of pastiche of wilderness. And it's been stocked deliberately with the animals which were appropriate to that particular ecological environment. And on that particular one, they actually had the whole big 5. They had lions, elephants, the leopards just passed through because no one can control leopards. They had buffalo, and they had 2 types of rhino. They had white rhino and black rhino, which is quite unusual. The black rhino are browsers, which tend to live in woody, hilly areas, and the white rhino are grazers, and they tend to live in flat, grassy areas. So they cultivated large areas of this place as grassland for the grassland type animals. And I watched the white rhino wading their way through it, eating grass. And I watched the lions stalking prey and hunting in it. It's very interesting. The only things you could actually see of the lions when they were still was their eyes and their noses, which are black. When they were motionless, you couldn't actually see the rest of them. They just blended in. As soon as they moved, you could see the outline. But even when they weren't moving, you could always see the nose and the eyes, which are just these black specks standing out in the grass. It was really interesting. But that was a completely controlled environment. So for the smaller animals, such as the impala, the springbok, the kudu, waterbuck, the warthogs, that kind of thing, they just did what they liked. They just got on with it. They just bred and multiplied and filled the place. But the bigger animals, the lions and the elephants particularly, had to be carefully managed. So that meant they had one family of elephants, which meant that when a young male reached a certain age, they had to take him off the farm so that he could go and breed somewhere else. And likewise with the lions. When the young male lions reached a certain age, they had to be taken off the farm and they had to go and breed somewhere else. And when I actually went there, the 2 young lions, 2 brothers, were learning to hunt. And they were still quite inept at it, which is why when I was watching them, they didn't manage to catch anything. And the guide is explaining that when these two young males had really learnt to hunt properly, then they'd be self-sufficient. Then they'd be basically taken off the farm to another place where they could use a couple of young male lions who would then breed with whatever female lions they already had. And that was the plan. They just keep moving them around. So this is a very carefully structured, managed process, but one which formed quite a good simulacrum of the wilderness. Now, those are serious animals. Lions, elephants, buffalo are serious animals. You don't want to mess with them. But they are also manageable, absolutely manageable. You know, it's entirely possible to maintain that environment indefinitely. That's not particularly challenging, in that whilst you have to deal with them in a very sensible and practical way, which needs a certain amount of ability and competence and equipping and all that kind of thing, it is eminently doable. You know, you're not talking about some terrifying challenge in which you know you're going to have a number of mortalities. You're doing something which is predictable, which you engage in, which you know you're going to go and do predictably for an indefinite period. You can do this as long as you like. And I thought, well, why can't we do that in Britain? Why can't we have 20, 30, 40,000 hectares of empty land and stock it with big mammals? Why not?
We could do if you longer a fence around it.
Yeah, of course you have a fence around it.
Yeah, that would be all right.
Yeah, of course you'd have a fence around it.
Because there's a lot of wild boars wandering around. Not far from you, I think. There's a couple in Gloucestershire and that, isn't there?
Oh, the Forest of Dean's got hundreds.
Yeah.
Hundreds. So, and it every time I go to somewhere like that, I think, well, why don't we do this? I'm sure, you know, that someone, George Monbiot, talks about the green desert in the middle of Wales, where you've got this vast expanse with almost nil biodiversity, almost no wildlife, no economic activity, virtually no population. Nothing happens. You know, nothing of any significance happens in the middle of Wales. Huge expanses of country, which are basically economically, socially dead. Now, if you took one of these expanses and you put, you know, set aside, fenced off a few 100,000 acres in that way, I think you could generate some income, generate some work, because that place that I just referred to had 5 game lodges on it, all of which had cooks, chamber staff, maintenance men, they had waiters, they had handymen, you know, you had people fixing the roads, the tracks, the fences, doing the painting, the redecorating, carrying stuff around. You know, there's a lot of employment going on there. A lot of people are employed. So there's a couple of villages around there which basically profited from the existence of this place. So the people running this estate, you know, had good relations with all the villages around, all the Zulu villages in the neighborhood. And it was a very much a two-way mutual beneficial relationship, in that the people living around got a variety of jobs, some of which are just manual labor and some of which are highly skilled. You know, so if someone was capable and educated, they could get a skilled job with a good education, with a good income, with good career prospects, you know, and good status. And if someone's a bit of a dummy and can't be bothered, they can get a manual work. They can go and just sweat and grunt for a living. And to my mind, we need sweaty, grunty jobs, because some men, basically, that's all they're good for. But there are other people that want to do interesting things, and it's good to have a bit of scope. And it struck me that something like that could actually be really good in Mid Wales. It can provide employment, could use tourism. Once you've got that kind of thing going, you can harvest the animals, you can sell trophies, you can sell hunting rights, you can have photography tours, artist tours. And the animals aren't that dangerous. You know, as long as you're not an idiot. You know, I sat there watching lions hunting without any danger to myself. You know, and it's because it's been set up that way, but it means that I can just sit and watch lions hunt in the open, no fence. And it's perfectly doable. You know, it's absolutely doable. It's completely practical. So, and I think actually to do that would be a morally responsible way of looking after creation in a way that's honoring to God. So, you know, I'd put it in fairly strong terms. To the extent that I'd say if we're not doing it, we're actually being negligent of our divinely appointed custodianship of creation. So there we go. It's now 10 to 10, and we haven't even got to animal rights.
Oh,
Yeah. Sorry about that. There we go. Anything you want to bring up before we say goodnight?
well, rights involve obligations, really. So if animals aren't moral agents, they have got rights as such, but we have bestowed rights upon them to be civilized people.
Well, we might say we have moral obligations to them.
Yeah.
You know, as Stanley Howes would put it, we have duties.
Yeah.
And the Bible certainly would say that we have duties. You know, we have duty of care towards our livestock, for example, but also we have a duty towards God to not be cruel or spiteful or malicious or negligent. So, yeah. So I suppose I'd be reluctant to say animals have rights, but I'd be very happy to say that we have duties towards them.
Yeah.
Because as you rightly point out, rights imply something which cannot be taken away. And there we are. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a long one, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff tonight.
Yeah.
It's a lot of stuff. There we go. Well, that's interesting anyway. So, should we say a prayer and then knock it on the head?
It's a good idea.
Okay, so Father, I thank you that we're fearfully, wonderfully made. We praise you, Lord, that you have chosen to make us in your image. And I pray, Father, that we can act in a way which is in accord with the way that you have made us, with the way that you have made the things around us, the whole created order around us. And that we'll deal with our animals, with our livestock, with the creatures of our environments in a way which recognizes how you made them, how you have ordered all things, as well as our responsibilities and our duties as the stewards of your creation. And we pray, Father, that we might recognize these things, that you'll give them wisdom, give us wisdom and discernment and understanding these things, so that we might do things in a way which is honoring to you. So we bless you, Lord, in Jesus' name.
Amen.
There we go.
Right.
Well, thanks for your time, Kevin and Rachel.
Yes. I don't think I'm here next week. I'm working, unfortunately.
There we are.
There we are.
Do you remember what Bertie Wooster said about working?
I don't think he ever encountered work, Bertie Wooster, did he?
Well, he was asked once, how would you support a wife? So he said, well, you know, I'd gently take her by the arm and guide her, you know. He said, no, working. Work, he said, work. Yeah, some people swear by it, you know, never tried it myself, don't really fancy it.
Well, that's true. They say hard work never killed anybody, but why take the risk?
There we go. Anyway, well, the Lord bless you, Kevin.
Yes, there you go. Well, good luck, everybody.
May the Lord bless you, Rachel. Good night.
Goodbye.